low budget, sleepless nights, a vision that terrified Hollywood. Join me as I unfold the making of A Nightmare on Elm Street, where dreams become deadly. This is the story of how Freddy Krueger stepped out of imagination and into our nightmares. So sit back, relax, and don't fall asleep. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unscripted, where this week we're talking about A Nightmare on Elm Street. So let's get right into it with our director, Wes Craven. He also wrote this film. The producers were John H. Burroughs. He was an associate producer. Robert Shea was the producer. Sarah Risher, co-producer. Stanley Duddleson and Joseph Wolf, executive producers. All movies start with an idea, and the idea for this came from a real story. Craven drew inspiration for A Nightmare on Elm Street from a true story he had come across in the LA Times. It was an article about a family who had survived and escaped the killing fields in Cambodia and made it to the US. Now, at first, things were fine, but their son began suffering from horrible nightmares. He was afraid to sleep. He was staying up for days at a time, and he was telling his parents that if he went to sleep, the thing chasing him would get him. Now, eventually, he finally did fall asleep, and his parents thought the crisis was over until they heard screams in the middle of the night. They ran to their son, only to find him dead. He had died in the middle of a nightmare. And here's a quote directly from Craven. Here was a youngster having a vision of horror that everyone older was denying. That became the central line of A Nightmare on Elm Street. The phenomenon occurred more times than one. Most commonly, the people affected were of Southeast Asian descent. This gave the phenomenon the name Asian Death Syndrome, but it was later changed to Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome. Now, here's a little bit more specific details about that article that he found. The son had told his parents, "I can't go to sleep. I'm going to die. I just know it." And his dad was a physician, so he gave his son sleeping pills. The next 2 nights, the kid stayed up awake, clearly trying not to sleep. On night 3, he finally slept, and his parents took him to his room, thinking they had avoided this problem, only to hear him screaming in the middle of the night. And they found him thrashing in his bed, and before they knew it, he was dead. His parents found the pills hidden in his bed, and they also found a coffee machine hidden inside of his closet. And Craven said that it was just like it was out of a movie. So with that idea, Craven began to write a story. Craven wrote Nightmare after he had worked on 2 films back to back. So he had earned enough from both of those to take 6 months off to write and refine his script for A Nightmare on Elm Street. After writing his story, Craven took his idea around to a lot of the bigger players in the film industry, but none of them showed interest. He showed his story to Sean Cunningham, who did Friday the 13th, and Cunningham told Craven that no one would be afraid of it because it's a dream, and they will know that it's a dream. Nightmare on Elm Street went around Hollywood for 3 years before it was finally picked up by Robert Shea, who finally showed interest in the script, and the film was taken in by New Line Cinema, which was a small 16mm distribution company at the time. Shea picked it up because he knew it was a strong story. It was something original, something that people could relate to. Dreams and nightmares. And one thing Shea always looks for is something that everyone can relate to. Now, a quick summary of the film before we get into casting. Essentially, this film is about a dream demon who comes to 4 teenagers in their dreams with one mission: to kill them in their sleep. Now, on to the casting of this film. Our casting director was Annette Benson. And for our characters in this film, Craven wanted heroines who didn't just trip and fall, but could pick themselves up and fight back if they had to. So our cast for this film, it is a rather small cast. I only took the people who played a significant role in this. There are a lot of uncredited contributors to the actors of this film. A lot of them were actually crew, which was really interesting. And there are also a lot of, a couple of extras that I have not included in this list, but we'll start from the top with John Saxon as Lieutenant Donald Thompson. Next up, we have Ronnie Blakely, who played Marge Thompson. And then we have Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy Thompson. And when Heather was cast, Wes had said that Heather embodied a legitimate girl next door, which is what he was looking for in Nancy. And the way Heather Langenkamp was cast in this, I found kind of interesting, her story into getting involved in this film. Her agent actually sent her to an audition in Hollywood at what she described as a dingy office in a pretty awful neighborhood. There were no chairs in the casting office, so she sat on the floor with the others that were there to audition while they waited to see the casting director. And then she read the sides they gave her for Nancy and left. A few days later, she got a call back. When she went back, the casting director brought actors in 2 by 2, so 2 at a time, one to play Tina and one to play Nancy. Heather was paired with Amanda Weiss, and Amanda Weiss is our actress who played Tina. Now, at this time, Wes Craven was with the casting director, and Heather and Amanda were sat side by side, and they read the scene where Amanda says, "You dreamed about the same creep I did." When Heather did her line, she says she remembers taking her hand and holding it like Freddy's claw, then scraping it through the air by Amanda's face. At the conclusion of the scene, Wes Craven told them both that they got the parts right there in the office. And she said it felt good to know that she would be able to pay a couple more months of rent. Now, when Heather was kind of developing the character for Nancy, she actually said she felt like she didn't need to do a lot of development for Nancy. She felt like she could just bring herself to the set and be as close to herself as possible to play this character. Up next, we have Amanda Weiss, who, as said before, played Tina Gray. And then we have, I'm probably going to butcher his name, Sue Garcia. He's credited as Nick Corey in the film. He played Rod Lane. And then we have Johnny Depp, who played Glenn Lance. And Johnny Depp was not the only one up for the role of Glenn at the time he was cast. Charlie Sheen actually also wanted the role of Glenn, but he also wanted $3,000 a week, and that was something that New Line at the time could not provide. And A Nightmare on Elm Street was actually Johnny Depp's very first film. Depp was friends with Nicolas Cage, who told him to try out acting. At this time, Johnny Depp was actually a musician. He was in a band before this film. So after Nick Cage told him to try acting, Johnny Depp met with Cage's agent, and his agent got him an audition for Nightmare. And Nightmare was, again, his first film, and he got the role with the help of Craven's daughter, who made the final choice for who got the role of Glenn after reading lines with him. When Wes Craven's daughter made the decision, the role was between Johnny Depp and another boy, and his daughter, Wes Craven's daughter, looked at him and told him to choose Johnny. And her reasoning was because he's beautiful. And that's how Johnny Depp landed his very first movie role as Glenn Lance. And then we have Joseph Whipp as Sergeant Parker. And finally, Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. And with the casting of Freddy Krueger, in most scary movies, the villains are actually cast as stuntmen. But Craven wanted a real actor in the role to bring some personality to the character. David Warner was originally cast as Freddy, but he backed out at the last minute due to prior commitments, and that's when Robert came in. Robert's agent suggested the film to him, and he was much younger than what Craven was originally looking for, but Craven ended up really liking his performance, and he was chosen for the role. And Englund ended up creating a very real character. The budget for this film, before we move on to too much more, the budget for this film was estimated to be at around $1.8 million. And then moving on to production and filming, I just want to point out some of our filming locations. They filmed in I don't know how to say that, North Guinness Avenue, Hollywood, Glendon Avenue, Venice, Venice Canals. They filmed at the John Marshall High School, at the Cahuenga, apologize if I said that wrong, Branch Library, the Evergreen Cemetery, Lincoln Heights Jail, the Kacha Institute for the Study of Sleep Disorders at the American Jewish University. And those are some of the locations that they filmed at. Now, a lot of this episode is going to be focused mostly on Freddy and the creation of Freddy, so we're going to start there for this next part. Wes chose the name Freddy from his own childhood. Freddy was the name of another boy who would bully him growing up. So a lot of the character Freddy came from personal experiences and things that happened or he witnessed in his life. And Craven remembers being a kid, hearing a mumbling one night and not knowing where it was coming from. So he got up out of bed and peeked out the window, and there was a man who looked like if you put Freddy down the street. And the man somehow sensed he was being watched, and he looked right into Craven's eyes. And this scared Craven, and he jumped back, sat on his bed, and waited for the man to go away. But when he went back to the window to check if he was still there, the guy made eye contact and kind of widened his eyes and jumped at him. Then, after that, he just started walking away. And Wes said that the guy had a sort of malice about him and a sick sense of humor in how delightful he found it to terrify a child. And he kind of drew inspiration from that experience to help create the character of Freddy. And if you take a close look, I mean, this movie was made in the 80s, so Freddy's done very practically. He's not done with any computer effects. Everything to do with this character has been done practically. And our makeup artist, one of our makeup artists, David Miller, was in charge of creating the design for Freddy's face. Miller said that the final design for Freddy was actually based on pepperoni pizza. That's right. I said pepperoni pizza. He was at a restaurant, deep in thought one night, and he began to move the cheese and the pepperoni around on his pizza. And he said he actually ended up making Freddy's face on the pizza. So the first day of makeup, David showed Robert a medical textbook full of real burn victims, and he looked at him and told him that that's what they were going to do to him. And as soon as they were done shooting scenes with Freddy, Robert would walk off set and just start taking all of the makeup off, and he would throw it behind him. So by the time he got back to makeup, half of it was already off. And he would actually have people following behind him, picking up the pieces, and they would look at the makeup artists and hold up the pieces and say, okay, which piece do I got? And when Robert was playing Freddy, he came up with and added very distinct, unique movements for Freddy's claws and his mannerisms and everything. And he made Freddy very original. He was very conscious about the choices he would make for this character, and he knew how great the silhouette and shadow could be when used properly, so he really physicalized Freddy a lot in this film. And some of the inspiration he got for his movements came from Klaus Kinsley and Jimmy Cagney. When you look at Freddy and you're watching him interact with the characters and these kids, you kind of notice that he plays with his victims and he scares them before he kills them because he knows that he scares them and he finds joy in that. He could kill them right away if he wanted to, but he doesn't. It's almost like foreplay to him before he kills them. He's in their dreams, he's in their beds, he's in their thoughts. It's violating to the kids, but it's fun for Freddy. And that is absolutely terrifying when you think about it. And when it came to the weapon that Freddy has, Craven actually was stuck on what he wanted the weapon to be for a while. And one of the questions he asked himself was, what is the earliest weapon that man might have feared. One of his first answers was the weapon of an animal. And when you think about that, you think claws. So he described the weapon as something with long fingernails. And the special effects designer Jim Doyle did some sketches, and he built a test finger to see kind of how the glove would look and function. And then one of our special effects assistants, Lou Carlucci, I think is how you say that. He was the one who actually built the full glove. And he said that building the glove, he kind of felt like he was building a whole character in the film. The glove, you can see in the film, you watch Freddy make it, and you can see that it's made in Freddy's basement. So when Lou was making the glove, he needed to take into account that this was made in some guy's basement, so he needed to make it look like it was crudely made. It was handmade, and quite literally it was handmade, and it was very real, too. The claw acts as an extension of Freddy and his evil, and it was also very heavy. Robert remembers how heavy it was, and he said that it affected his posture and it made his one shoulder droop a little bit. So he used that and he made it part of his character. It became like a signature part of his character, actually, and he used that to his advantage to make Freddy more scary than he already was. And then in the scene where Tina meets Freddy, it's one of those very first scenes. It's in the opening scene. When Freddy's arms are extending, that extension of his arms was actually done with a simple marionetting effect. They had guys up on the roofs with kind of long versions of fishing poles, and they had wires holding up Freddy's arms. That's how they made his arms move and how they made his arms extend. And the cinematographer, Jacques, he actually thought that it would look too fake or even cheesy, and he was actually surprised at how well it came out. As you've noticed, I've gone into quite a few already practical effects. That's what all of this movie is. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is those practical effects and how they pulled it off in the film. One of the first big effects that we see is in the very first death scene, which is Tina's death. And when they were filming this and when Wes was writing it, he wanted something big and fantastic for the first death. And a rotating room was actually suggested for this scene, and that's what they ended up using. They took it from Fred Astaire dancing on the walls and roof. When she's being dragged up the wall and onto the ceiling, there are actually no wires holding her up. It's just the room rotating, and she's crawling and acting like she's being dragged around the room. All of the props and furniture that we see in the room, they had to nail it down so that it would stay in place, and the cameraman was strapped into an airplane seat that was attached to the wall. And the way they rotated the room was they had a couple people who would stand outside it, and they would manually rotate it themselves. There were no mechanical means used to move this room around. It was pure manpower. Now, Amanda said that she was either crawling or being dragged around the room, but she was always on the floor. And it was a very disorienting scene for her to do. And at the end of the take, she stood up and said she couldn't move. She had the sensation of falling, and she screamed for help. And Wes popped his head through the window and started to reassure her, but then he himself started feeling nauseated. When Tina falls onto the bed, that's not actually Amanda. They used a stunt woman for that. They loaded the bed up with fake blood so that it would splash when she landed, but they couldn't actually show any of that splash because when it got to the censors went after the whole scene and said they couldn't show any of the splatter. So none of that actually made it into the movie. Absolutely nothing was fake. When they were filming this movie, everyone was there. They were all in the same room acting, and they would usually, and I find this like really impressive, they would usually get scenes done in 1 or 2 takes. Amanda, who plays Tina, Tina's the first to die. And Amanda, even though her character's dead, was still very involved in the film because Tina still showed up. And Amanda actually ended up doing a lot of the really gross things. So the scene where she's in a bloody body bag, she's actually inside of a bloodied up body bag. When she's got centipedes crawling out of her mouth, she actually has centipedes in her mouth. When they were doing that, she called it at 3. So what they did with her was they really kind of pushed to see how far she was willing to go to do these really gross things for the film, which I find really impressive. Like some of the things she did for this movie, I feel like a lot of people wouldn't like willingly do anymore. We're gonna jump back to Freddy really quick. I want to talk about his costume a little bit. His costume, he's got like a beat up fedora. Wes got that from the guy he saw outside his window. He's also got a sweater that's red and green striped. Wes said he got that from an article about how the eye and the retina deal with color. The eyes actually find it very difficult to see red and green side by side. So he took that and he gave those colors to Freddy, and he ended up making Freddy a literal optical effect that was kind of painful to look at. And while we're on the topic of Wes, our director and our producer, Wes and Robert, they actually had a lot of tension between them during filming, and we'll talk about a couple situations where this kind of affected the film. But Bob mortgaged his house and a lot of other things in order to make this film. And Wes actually signed away all of the rights to the characters in it to create the film. So there was a lot on the line and there was a lot of tension between them. They argued a lot on set. And one of the disagreements that they actually got into was about who gets to do what. Bob felt like he should be the director and Wes wanted to be the director because it was his story. In the end, Wes and Bob decided that Bob would stick as the producer. They shared a vision of the end, but they didn't exactly share a vision of a path to get there. Another one of the arguments that they had was about the sticky stairs, and that one ended up being actually like a really big argument. Bob had this image in his head that he was kind of obsessed with, and Wes wasn't really interested in it. Bob suggested a lot of things that came from his own nightmares to Wes, and the sticky stairs was one of them. Wes wasn't really on board with it, and it kind of became like a big argument. In the end, though, they did obviously end up going through with it. And the sticky stairs is another one of those practical effects. And they made those with Bisquick. What they did was they mixed it too thick and then they let it sit for about an hour so that it would become extremely sticky and gooey looking. And then Jim Doyle, who was one of our special effects designers, he said there were 80 effects shots or sequences within the 90 minutes of the film, and they shot all of those within the span of 26 days. And then we'll move on to the bathtub scene, the scene where Nancy is sitting in the tub and Freddy reaches through the water and grabs her, drags her down. This, again, was done practically. What they did was they built a tub that had no bottom in it, but instead there was a tank underneath it. Heather actually sat on one of the crew's knees and she had her feet up on his shoulders. And this lasted for almost an entire day. And he was actually the one with the Freddy claw that comes out of the water and grabs her. And then we move on to the second death in the film, and that's going to be Rod's death. And Rod's death was very technically complicated. They tried to use fish wire, but it wasn't strong enough to hold him up, and it broke. And the first time he actually crashed and fell. And then the part where it snakes around his neck, that was actually shot in reverse. That's because at the time that this movie was being made, that was actually the only way that they could do it. And then when Nancy's on the phone, I think she's called Glenn, and the phone turns into Freddy's mouth and tongue on the phone. That was just a silly little $5 effect. And a funny thing about that is Heather eventually ended up wanting to take the prop home with her. And then the next one we have is Glenn's death. This is the third death in the film. And for his death, they ended up reusing the rotating room from Tina's death scene. And the blood shooting out of the bed was done in one take. It had to be done in one take. Once they let the blood go, there was no going back. So it had to be done in one take. What they did was they turned the room upside down so the bed was on the ceiling. And the blood was actually just red water, and someone was up on top dumping water through. So they dumped the water through the hole, and the water immediately hit the lights. So the guy that was pouring the water actually ended up getting electrocuted, and the weight of the water shifted the room, and the room got out of control from the operators, and there was no way to stop it. The room rolled all the way over because the weight of the blood went to one side of the ceiling, and the crew, they were jumping out of the way of the cables and ropes that were being ripped out of the room. Water went into all of the lights. There were huge flashes and then darkness. So then the room and those that were in the room were spinning out of control just in the dark. And the room had a window in it, and blood ended up spilling out of that window and getting all over the crew. Well, the red water, that was the blood, ended up spilling out of the room and getting all over the crew that was standing closest to that window. The room ended up stopping upside down, and it left the crew that was in the room hanging upside down for at least 20 minutes. One of the crew members that was in this room was actually Wes. He was in a chair strapped to the wall in this room so that he could record it. So he was stuck there for 20 minutes just in his chair. He did say that no one was hurt in the end, and they did get the shot, and that's why the scene kind of looks the way it does, because of that one silly little mistake. It still turned out, though. In the end, it was all right. No one was hurt, and they got the shot for the scene. And there was actually supposed to be more to Depp's death scene in this film. After Glenn gets sucked into the bed and water is shot out of the bed everywhere, Glenn's head was supposed to come out of the bed and his body was supposed to rise out of it. Essentially what was supposed to happen was the bed was supposed to just spit Glenn back out, but that part of the scene was cut. In the film, towards the end of the film, we see a lot of booby traps, a lot of traps set for Freddy when Nancy decides, I have to do this, I have to catch him. And a lot of those booby traps, Wes read an army guide that was titled Improvised Weapons, and this book was all about booby traps. It was all just little traps, and the traps that they used, they either came from this book or they came from somebody's mind. After a while, they actually had to look at Craven and say, no more booby traps. We cannot do any more, because he had tried to put so many into the film. And the shot of Freddy lit on fire when he falls down the stairs, they did that in one take. So the stuntman was lit on fire, he fell down the stairs, jumps back up, runs back up the stairs. All of that was done in one take. He was lit up for a very long time. And in the end, when Nancy realizes that to stop Freddy, she needs to turn her back on fear. Initially, the ending that Wes had in mind was Nancy waking up on a bright morning and it was over. But Bob had other ideas. He had the idea to leave the end with a hook, with Freddy coming back, so that they could do a sequel. And Wes kind of thought that a sequel would never happen, but turns out he was wrong. There are 8 total Freddy movies. In the end scene, they shot 4 different endings, each of them with something different happening to the car. And each one had the feeling that Freddy was the car. And this was another thing that Bob and Wes ended up fighting over. And Wes finally gave in and said, okay, we'll put him in a car, because Wes really wanted to end it. He didn't want to add a scene to kind of keep the franchise going. He just wanted to end it. But eventually he did give in and he said, all right, we'll put him in a car. In one of the endings, Freddy was the driver. In another ending, Johnny was the driver. And in another one, they did another one with the top coming up. And in another one, they did with the top not coming up. It stays down. And then they pan over to the little girls jumping rope, singing the song about Freddy. And I have one final effect that I want to go over, and that's the effect with Ronnie, who plays Nancy's mom, where she gets kind of sucked through the door window at the end. And what they did here was they built an articulated doll, and they dressed it up as Ronnie. And they made it squishy so that it could be pulled through the window and sucked through the window. And that's how that final effect worked. And there are lots of other effects, I'm sure, but these are the ones that I found most interesting and wanted to talk about. And finally, we have the soundtrack and the score. The composer for this film was Charles Bernstein, and the nursery rhyme that the girls at the end are singing, it had already been worked out by the time he had gotten involved in the film. Wes wrote it, actually. And then Heather's boyfriend at the time, he put some of the chords together for it, and Bernstein kept both and finished it. Bernstein wrote Freddy's theme to mess with our sense of order, and he did this by using notes that didn't belong. So think of it this way. He would play scales, but instead of playing them the proper way, he'd take one of the notes and he'd switch it for a different one to make it sound off-putting. Finally, we have the release and the box office. This movie came out on November 9th, 1984. The film could have destroyed New Line. There was a lot of tension around the release of this film, but it was actually a huge success. There was a very long line for the film on opening day, and it was a hit. It was a crucial success, especially for New Line and Wes. And it was the first film that made money for New Line. It put Wes into the big time. He became known as the Horror Meister, and it achieved cult status very quickly. The box office for this film domestically earned $25,624,448. Internationally, it earned $213,514. And in total, that adds up to $25,858,510. It didn't make a lot. If you compare it to other like big box office successes, it didn't make as much as them. But for New Line and for Wes, this was huge. This was a huge success for both of them and for everybody involved in the film, especially because this film had gone through Hollywood for so many years. It had been turned down by so many people because nobody thought it would succeed, and then it did. And it earned money actually for the company that distributed it. So this was very, very big. And then in 2024, it was announced that Robert Englund would receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He is part of the class of 2025 nominees, and his star is set to be unveiled on October 31st, 2025. So this year, he will get his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame this week. And with that, we conclude our episode on A Nightmare on Elm Street. Thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget to follow me on all of the social medias at unscripted.cs. On Instagram and TikTok, I do post a lot of fun little things up there as well. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't. I'm going to start uploading some videos there soon as well. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you all in the next one.